All right, let's dive into this report. India in 2025, a nation in transition. It's really a deep dive into where India is right now and where they might be headed.
Hmm.
I've already seen some super interesting stuff here about their economy, their society, their role in the world. Like, wow, what were your first impressions when you saw this report?
The thing that struck me was this kind of push and pull, this like duality that seems to run through everything in India right now. You see it in their economic outlook, which is projected to be one of the fastest growing globally. We're talking maybe 6 to 7% GDP growth.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, their Make in India program seems like a serious effort to really boost their manufacturing, and their service sector is already massive. So are they on track to become like a global economic superpower?
They could be. But there's some big buts here. The report doesn't shy away from that. It talks about how they've got this huge growth, but also persistent inflation. And unemployment is still a major issue. And the wealth gap, it's just massive.
Yeah. Right? It's like two different Indias almost. And the report does touch on that rural growth lagging behind and the need to support farmers better. They also mention how India's startup scene is blowing up. Fintech, edtech, health tech, all these areas just exploding with opportunity. But I wonder, is that opportunity really open to everyone? Or are we going to see these inequalities get worse?
That's a really important question. It sort of takes us right into the political landscape where you see these same tensions playing out in some pretty interesting ways.
Well, the report called India's political scene dynamic, which honestly sounds a bit intense. What's your take on that?
Oh, it's definitely lively. You have strong leadership, no question,
Great.
but also a very active opposition. So even though the 2024 elections gave the current government a strong mandate, there's still some pretty big debates going on, like federal-state relations, minority rights, and even just like the nuts and bolts of getting policies actually implemented. It's complicated.
It sounds like it. I mean, it's like this constant push and pull between different groups, different ideas about what India's future should look like. And then you throw social media into the mix. The report says that's really fueled political activism, which could be a good thing, right?
It can be, but it's also raising concerns about freedom of the press and freedom of speech. The report kind of hints at this tension between wanting more people to participate in politics, but also wanting to protect these fundamental freedoms. It's a balancing act.
It definitely is. I was also really interested in what the report said about the rise of regional political parties. It seems like they're having a bigger and bigger impact, especially since national politics relies so much on these coalitions.
It's another layer of complexity, and it shows how important it is to understand those regional perspectives, those different interests that are shaping the national conversation, because it's not a monolithic country, right?
Yeah. No, not at all. So we've got this booming economy, but with these built-in problems, and a political scene that's, let's say, energized. What about the social and cultural side of things? How's Indian society changing with all of this happening?
It's changing fast.
Mm.
Urbanization is a huge factor. People are moving to cities, lifestyles are changing. And that creates new opportunity, but it also puts a strain on infrastructure and resources. And then you have rural India, which is struggling with its own set of problems. Inequality, lack of access to basic services. It's like two different worlds.
Like those two Indias again, right? Developing side by side, but at completely different speeds.
Yeah, kind of. And the report talks about how women are making progress in education and in the workforce, which is great. But it also points out that violence and discrimination against women are still huge problems.
Yeah, it's like progress is being made, but these deeply ingrained issues are so hard to change. It reminds me of what they said about the caste system. Officially, it's abolished, but the report says caste-based discrimination is still very real in some places.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. There are these social structures that have been around for centuries, and they don't just disappear overnight.
That's true, but the report seems to suggest that the younger generation is really shaking things up. They're super tech-savvy, entrepreneurial, and they seem ready to challenge those old ways of thinking. Do you think they're actually changing the face of India?
I think they are. They're pushing boundaries, they're demanding more opportunities, and they're not afraid to question the old rules. They're connected to the world, they're comfortable with technology, and they're vocal about what they want. It's a really interesting mix of traditional values and a modern outlook.
It's like they're bridging the gap between the old India and the new one, creating their own path. And that makes me think about another area where India is making a splash: technology. The report paints this picture of a country that's becoming a tech powerhouse.
They are. The Digital India campaign has just exploded internet access, and that's fueled this incredible growth in their tech industry. AI, blockchain, quantum computing, they're doing it all.
And I was blown away by their achievements in space exploration. ISRO, their space agency, is launching missions, collaborating with other countries. They're a major player in space now.
And they're doing it all on a surprisingly small budget, which really says something about their ingenuity and how resourceful they are. But of course, all this digital transformation comes with some risks too.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. What does the report say about the potential downsides of this tech takeover?
Well, one of the big concerns is data privacy and cybersecurity. As India moves into this digital future, they're having to figure out how to protect people's information and make sure everything is secure. It's a classic double-edged sword. Amazing possibilities, but also some real danger.
It's a whole new world, right? Full of opportunities, but also risks. It makes you feel kind of excited and a little bit nervous at the same time.
Exactly. And that brings us to another area where this duality is really clear, the environment. The report is pretty blunt about the challenges India is facing there.
This is one of the parts that really got to me. The air pollution in the big cities is terrifying. Water scarcity is impacting millions of people. And then you add climate change on top of that with more floods and droughts. It just feels like an incredibly urgent situation.
It is. And the report doesn't sugarcoat it, but it also highlights what India is doing to try to fix these problems, especially when it comes to renewable energy. They're really pushing solar and wind power, setting some ambitious targets for cutting emissions.
So it sounds like they understand how serious this is, and they're trying to shift to a more sustainable way of doing things. But I'm guessing it's not that simple.
No, it's not. They're still very reliant on coal. And industrial pollution is a huge issue. The report mentions things like planting more trees and sustainable urban planning, but it also says that enforcing those policies can be really hard. It's a race against time, basically.
It's like they're trying to walk this tightrope between growing their economy and protecting their environment. And so many countries are struggling with that same balance.
They are. And speaking of balancing acts, the report also looks at healthcare and education in India. What were your thoughts on that?
One thing that stood out to me was that India's healthcare system has actually gotten better, especially since the pandemic. They've been focusing more on digital health solutions and expanding health insurance. The report specifically mentions the Ayushman Bharat program, which is aiming to give health insurance to millions of people, and they're also expanding primary care centers.
So they're definitely trying to make healthcare more accessible, but is it really working? Is everyone benefiting from these changes?
That's the big question. Access and affordability are still big problems, especially in rural areas. And there's a big difference in the quality of care you get in cities versus in the countryside. It's still a work in progress.
And what about education? How is India's education system dealing with all these rapid changes? They're definitely trying to revamp it, to focus more on skills and research. The National Education Policy, they call it NEP 2020, is a big part of that. But the switch to online learning during the pandemic really showed how unequal access to technology and the internet is in India.
That's right. The report talked about that digital divide and how it's leaving millions of people behind.
It's a reminder that even as India is making these huge leaps forward in technology, there are a lot of people who are being left out.
So it sounds like there's still a lot of work to do to make sure everyone benefits from these advances.
Definitely. And that brings us to another really important part of India's story, their role on the world stage. The report calls them a major player in global diplomacy, which makes sense, given everything we've talked about.
Yeah, they're clearly a rising power. And what they do is going to impact the whole world. What does the report say about how India is dealing with all these complicated international relationships?
Honestly, it's like they're walking a tightrope. They're trying to balance their relationships with countries like the US, China, and Russia, while also building stronger ties with Southeast Asia and groups like BRICS and the Quad.
I remember they have this neighborhood first policy. Seems like they're trying to improve relations with the countries around them. But I'm sure there are still some tensions in the region.
There are border disputes, and old conflicts haven't gone away. And the report mentions that India is modernizing their military and focusing on maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. It's clear they're becoming more assertive on the world stage.
So they're trying to find their place in this world that's changing so fast. They're balancing their own interests with their growing role as a global power. It's a lot to think about.
It is, and we've really only just scratched the surface here. This first look at India has been fascinating. It's such a complex and contradictory country.
It really is.
Yeah.
And as we go deeper into this report, we'll see how all these pieces fit together and what they might tell us about India's future, and maybe even our own. It's amazing, right, how everything we've been talking about in India, it's like you can't separate one thing from another. The economy, the politics, the social changes, the tech, it's all connected.
Totally. It's like a giant tapestry. And that's one of the things that makes this report so interesting. It doesn't just give you facts, it really shows how all these different forces are interacting and shaping India today.
Exactly. Like, you can't talk about India's economic growth without thinking about what it's doing to the environment, or talk about their tech advancements without acknowledging that huge digital divide. It's all part of the same story.
And it's a story that's happening on a massive scale. I mean, India is on track to become the most populous country in the world, even bigger than China. And that adds another layer of complexity to everything.
It's almost hard to grasp the sheer number of people whose lives are being impacted by all of this. It really makes you realize that the choices India makes today, they're going to have consequences that reach far beyond their borders.
Absolutely. It's a country that's just too big, too important to ignore. And this report really highlights the crucial decisions that India is facing at this point in their history.
The report talks about all these initiatives they're working on: Make in India, Digital India, the national education policy. They sound promising, but it also points out some pretty serious roadblocks.
Yeah, there's this recurring theme, right, of good intentions running up against some really deep-seated problems. Corruption, bureaucracy, inequality. These are things that India has been wrestling with for decades, and they're not going to be solved easily.
And then there's the issue of actually making things happen. The report talks about how even when they have good policies in place, putting them into practice can be a whole other challenge.
Right, it's one thing to have a vision. It's another thing entirely to make that vision a reality on the ground.
So what do you think are some of the biggest obstacles that India needs to overcome to reach its full potential?
That's a tough one. But the report gives us some hints, I think. For example, let's look at their education system. They're making reforms, which is great, but there's still a big disconnect between what students are learning and the skills they need in today's economy. And then you have that digital divide we talked about. If millions of people can't access technology and the internet, how are they going to be part of this digital revolution that's happening?
And the environmental challenges. It just seems so daunting. It's like they're fighting a losing battle on so many fronts.
It is, and it's not just about pollution. Climate change is a huge threat to India's future. They're already seeing the effects, with rising sea levels, more extreme heat waves, and changes in rainfall that are impacting agriculture. It's going to have major economic and social consequences if they don't get it under control.
It's true. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the scale of the problems. But I think it's also important to remember how resilient and resourceful the Indian people are. They've overcome so much throughout history.
That's a really important point. And the report does highlight some pretty incredible success stories. The tech industry is booming. They're making advancements in space exploration. There's a growing middle class. There's a lot to be proud of.
And let's not forget the cultural richness and diversity of India. Their art, their music, their entrepreneurial spirit, their sense of community. There's so much beauty and strength there.
Absolutely. It's like this constant dance between the old and the new, the traditional and the modern. And that's part of what makes India so fascinating. It's a country that's always evolving, always changing, always reinventing itself. And that process is never easy. It's messy, but it's also what keeps things moving forward.
One thing that really stood out to me in the report was how much emphasis they put on the younger generation. They are the ones who are going to inherit all of this, and they're already having such a big impact.
Oh, absolutely. They're becoming a powerful force, and they're not afraid to challenge the way things have always been done. They're demanding more opportunities, they're pushing for more equality, and they're holding their leaders accountable.
There's a real sense of energy and optimism there, even though they're facing such huge challenges.
There is. It gives me hope for India's future. They're not just inheriting a set of problems, they're also inheriting this legacy of innovation, resilience, and a determination to make things better. And they're building on that legacy in ways that are really exciting to see.
It is inspiring, right?
Yeah.
You just want to cheer them on and see them succeed.
I know, right? It reminds you that even when things seem really complicated and uncertain, there's always room for hope and progress.
So well said. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today exploring this intricate picture of India in 2025. But our deep dive isn't over yet. When we come back, we'll dig into some of the key takeaways from this report and talk about what it all means for India's future, and maybe even our own. And we're back. For the last part of our deep dive into India in 2025, we've been looking at this incredible report, India in 2025, a nation in transition. It's given us a lot to think about, right? All that economic energy, those tech leaps, but also those big inequalities, those environmental worries. As we kind of wrap this up, what really jumps out at you?
It's funny. The thing that keeps coming back to me is that sense of duality. The report does a great job of showing it. It's like India has all these strengths, these amazing things going for it. But at the same time, there are these weaknesses, these challenges that they just can't seem to shake. It's like two sides of the same coin.
It's true. It's like that contrast is built into everything in India, the economy, the politics, even their society.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of leads into another big theme from the report. Transformation in India is changing so fast right now, it's almost hard to keep up with. Urbanization is exploding, technology is changing everything. New demands. It's kind of busying.
It really is. It's like the whole country is in this constant state of flux. And that creates tons of opportunities, but also a whole lot of challenges. And that brings me to what I think is maybe the most important takeaway from this report: choice.
I totally agree. India is at this crossroads, and the decisions they make in the next few years are going to be huge. Not just for them, but for the whole world, really.
The report makes that point really clear, doesn't it? It's not just about trying to guess what's going to happen. It's about understanding all the factors involved and realizing that India has the power to shape its own future.
It does. And that's both exciting and kind of scary. They have the potential to become a world leader in so many areas, but they're also facing some incredibly tough problems.
So let's talk about those choices. What are some of the big decisions India is going to have to make as they go through this transformation?
Well, on the economic side, I think one of the biggest things is figuring out how to balance growth with fairness. How do they make sure that everyone benefits from this booming economy, not just the wealthy few?
Right. We talked about the wealth gap, the difference between urban and rural India, the need to give more opportunities to people who have been left behind. It's not just about making the pie bigger. It's about making sure everyone gets a slice.
Exactly. It's about making sure everyone has a chance to succeed.
Mm.
And on the political side, there's the challenge of making those democratic institutions even stronger, making sure people can speak their minds freely, that the press can report without fear, and finding ways to deal with social divisions to bring people together in a country that's so diverse.
For sure. And we can't forget about the environment. Those challenges aren't going away. India has to find a way to grow its economy without destroying its environment. They have to switch to cleaner energy. They have to deal with climate change, all while trying to lift millions of people out of poverty.
It's a huge task, but the report seems to say that at least they're asking the right questions now. They're starting to understand what needs to be done.
It sounds like they're taking some steps in the right direction, but it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of political will to really make a difference.
It will. And it makes you realize that India's story isn't just about India. It's about all of us. What happens there is going to affect everyone, whether we realize it or not.
So true. So as we finish up this deep dive, what's the message we want to leave our listeners with? What's the takeaway from all of this?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important for people to understand that India is a rising power. What happens there matters. It's going to impact the global economy. It's going to affect international relations. It's even going to play a role in how we deal with climate change.
And on a more personal level, I think India's story reminds us that we're all connected. The choices we make, whether we're in India or somewhere else, they have an impact. That ripple effect, it goes further than we think.
I like that. And when we think about India, I think it's important to approach it with curiosity, with empathy, with a desire to learn from their experiences, not with judgment or fear.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Well, folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive into India in 2025. It's been a wild ride, hasn't it? We've learned so much, we've seen the challenges, but we've also seen that incredible potential.
Absolutely. And this is just the beginning, right? We encourage everyone to keep exploring, to dig deeper into the things that really stood out to them, and to stay tuned as India's story continues to unfold.
Yes, keep learning, keep asking questions. And as you do, think about this. This report focused on economics, politics, technology. But what about the cultural impact of all these changes? What happens to a society's values, its traditions, when things change so quickly? What are the effects on people's lives, their minds? It's something to think about. Until next time.